My talk is about the diffusion, which means the spread, if you like, of the serpent knowledge. That's what the knowledge was called. And the golden age of the angels, watchers, and druids. So I hope you will take my angels seriously when I'm talking about angels. And you'll see a little bit of an alternative view, which I believe connects into what everybody really feels about angels being the teachers, the craftsmen, and the people who originally cared over us and perhaps still do in another form. The two key books are The Genius of the Few and the story of those who founded the Garden of Eden, and the masterwork, which covers a whole range of things, called The Shining Ones. The previous DVDs, which were recorded by the Holistic Channel, £10 for the part 1 and 2, and £6 for the part 3. The overview, which will fill you in with the story that I've been telling since I first gave the first part 1 here in November of last year, is that survivors from global catastrophe arrive in southern Lebanon round about 9,500 BC to restart agriculture and civilization at Karsag, which means head enclosure, or Eden, the Hebrew name, or the Garden of Eden, as most of us know it from the Bible. They were led by a man called An and a man called Enil, Enil being the son of An, together with 7 archangels, led by a woman who we know as Gabriel, but in fact Gabriel was a title for her job as governor of the Garden of Eden, or governor of Karsag, was known by another name, far more common name within the Sumerian literature, as Ninhursag or Nin-Karsag, which I believe is the correct terminology in O'Brien. This comes from Christian O'Brien. Those 3 form what we know as the triad, the famous triad of 2 men and a woman, responsible in the history of all the ancient civilizations for this wonderful restart of civilization and agriculture, which has brought us where we are today. Now, if you include An and Enil and the 7 archangels, which include Ninkarsag, you then have the N-head of 9 gods who begat gods. They are joined by the watchers, who are also teachers and craftsmen. Subsequent generations are known of the people of the god An. Subsequent generations are known as the people of the god An. For example, the 2 Arthedanan and the Druids are subsequent generations of this group of people in southern Lebanon. They set up the golden age of the city-states under the divine laws of An and Enil, and were later described as the immortal gods. Enoch, on being summoned by An, is taken by 2 angels and visits the planted highlands. So this word heaven, Hashemin, with a root of Shem in the middle there, refers to seed, and a place which is not some nebulous place in the sky, but an actual place where the settlement and the art of agriculture took place. In the Bruce Codex, Jesus refers to being at the building of knowledge at Karsag when Enoch was there. Muhammad describes a similar visit, refers to Enoch, and claims contact with Gabriel, or the Gabriel, who could have been much later generations. So there's a very distinct link between, in particular, Jesus and Muhammad, and the story, the original story of the Garden of Eden, or the Karsag settlement. The philosophy and practice of the Golden Age, which spread around the world, is contained within the archaic Sumerian records, from which the Vedic, Hebrew, Christian, Islamic, and other records eventually evolved. This Golden Age, which links with what was later described as the Abrahamic faith, both Jesus and Muhammad wanted to get back to the Abrahamic faith. We know who Abraham was. We know of Abraham's links with the Enil in later times. But the whole Golden Age structure, which was founded and thrived very successfully, was destroyed by global catastrophe. If we want to look in the history books and see what the thinking man's philosopher, whose name is Plato, thought about these gods and what he said about these gods, it's very relevant in looking at these people, I believe, as totally or principally benevolent people. Once upon a time, the gods divided up the earth between them, not in the course of a quarrel, for it would be quite wrong to think that the gods do not know what is appropriate to them, or that knowing it, they would want to annex what property belongs to others. Each gladly received his just allocation and settled his territories. And having done so, they proceeded to look after us, their creatures and children, as shepherds look after their flocks. They did not use physical means of control like shepherds, who direct their flocks with blows, but brought their influence to bear on the creature's most sensitive part, using persuasion as a steersman uses the helm, to direct the mind as they saw fit, and so guide the whole moral creature. There are at least 10 major philosophers and historians who all take a benevolent view of the gods being benevolent, being the teachers and craftsmen. And in all the tribal histories, virtually without exception, we find that they give credit to the gods for delivering civilization and agriculture. And this is very much true of the Assyrians and the palaces of Ashburnapal and the palace of Sargon II, in the area of Khorshabab, in the area not far from present-day Mosul in Iraq. We've talked about climate change and what we're looking at, and I think we've all taken on board this weekend just how much climate change has influenced civilizations in the past, the ups and downs, the highs and lows. And the basic thesis, which I've already presented, is that we had a supernova explosion which led to extremely hostile conditions here for a very long period of time, while we had the initial flash, the shock wave, and then the debris arriving at the end of the so-called ice age, and then this period of great stability, very small variations in temperature, in which we find civilization starting. And we soon find ourselves in an environment where farming can take place under certain conditions. Now, the place that was chosen was the area 8 miles north of Mount Hermon, 25 miles west of Damascus, in this extraordinary Rift Valley. We all know about the Dead Sea in this area here, which is 1,300 feet below sea level approximately here, running up to the Sea of Galilee, running up to what's called the anti-Lebanon Mountains and the Lebanon Mountains. And this was a breadbasket for the Romans. It's still a breadbasket for the people who live in Lebanon, and it's been a fertile, productive valley and plain back to this 9,500 BC date. And we know that from the pollen cores and all the work that's been done on ancient farming, bioarchaeology it's called, looking at sediment cores, and we can see that this is a central location for important activities at that early time. What had happened? Just a brief part of the talk is to review the evidence from 3 or 4 specialists. This is basically what happened, and it's recorded by the Sumerians, and it's very important. This is the debris from that supernova explosion, which I've talked about, coming into our solar system, passing by the planets, Pluto being pulled into a new orbit. We've got all sorts of effects, pieces torn off an incoming object. Uranus has its equatorial alignment changed, moons deranged. Saturn being moved out of its normal orbit. And then we have Tiamat, an object in our gap between what we now call the asteroid belt, breaks up due to the collision. And then Kingu, which is a satellite of the main object, crashes into the Earth. Venus has its rotational spin reversed, and Mercury is also disrupted. So we have a really massive catastrophe problem from the debris of this supernova explosion coming into our system round about 10,800. So this possible polar flight paths of a disintegrating aerial objects coming in from here, as you can see, with supercooled gas, debris, dust, little pellets, you name it, but a major disaster which would have tipped the Earth on its axis. At that time, we find that the Earth's crust is quite different to what it is now, and this area of Beringa here was above sea level and part of this big continent in this area. Fenno-Scandinavia here, Appalachia here. And we can see, if you like, the evidence of massive movements and a crustal rippling of the Earth's crust. The Earth's crust is rather like the skin of a rice pudding, so these kind of objects and this much disruption would have created mayhem. And it's described as the biggest mass extinction for 3.5 million years, very recently. This is a tentative reconstruction of the pre-catastrophic Pleistocene world before catastrophe, circa 10,000 BC. Pleistocene and the Holocene. The Holocene is the wholly recent period of time, which equates to that stability in temperature which I showed you earlier. But here we have a great sea in the middle of the Sahara. We have land going out to the Azores. The Azores zinc to Africa. The story of the Atlantis being here, having elephants, ties in with that being connected with Africa. We've got a large area of inland sea or ocean running right the way through Siberia, including the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and a sea here in this area in China. So massive disruptions. And Bernard Dallaire, who I'm talking to regularly, and he's coming to lecture at the Ancient History Forum in Shaftesbury, says that there was a 50-mile movement in the Earth's crust at this particular juncture, which has been recorded by scientists. It also explains the massive movement along the outside, if you like, or the western edge of the South America, where the Andes have been pushed up, and Lake Titicaca is something like 16,000 feet above sea level, and all sorts of restructuring in this area of the Pacific. And this to most people would be just unbelievable. It's taken me a long while for this to sink in, but this is, in my opinion, the best view from the best geologists we have of simply the fact that the Earth's crust was in a catastrophic state at that time. And this is where we get the story of the Great Flood and all the other issues which are recorded in the Bible and recorded in folk history. This is the second major reference point, which is the Cycles of Cosmic Catastrophe by Richard Firestone. And here we're looking at the heavy metal print, the thorium print here, following a large object. They're not quite sure how large, almost impossible to tell, but big enough certainly to create the Carolina Bays and to cause massive disruption and fires and later on floods. John Gagnon is the third key person. This is a brilliant book, in my opinion, because it brings together the Velikovsky evidence, the Allen and Dallaire evidence, a whole range of important scientific documents, and it's called The Message from the Ancients. And what is shown here very clearly is this ice sheet, the European ice sheet and the North American ice sheet, which has been displaced from where it was at this particular time. And it explains a great deal about all the geological evidence of where ice is, where erosion from ice is, etc. The key point about John's book, and there's lots of more detail which is fascinating, is that the Great Pyramid was built, and I believe that I can reliably say that it is accepted and well dated that the Great Pyramid was built at 2450 BC. Now, in that Great Pyramid, you have the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber. In the King's Chamber, which you can't see on there, I'm afraid, it hasn't come out clearly, you have a situation where you have one star shaft pointing that way, one pointing the other. This one points to Alpha Draconis, which was the North Star precisely at the time that Great Pyramid was built, and this is Zeta Orionis, which is within the three stars of Orion's belt, which was in that position at the same period of time. So you have both the South and North stars recorded if you take a line straight up those star shafts. The Queen's Chamber star alignment would have shown Alpha Draconis and Zeta Orionis at 10,400 before the catastrophe, before the Earth tipped on its axis. So all the tremendous amount of work that went into the Great Pyramid was to leave a message for us as to what had happened. and also for their surveyors to be able to calculate and recalculate and resurvey the Earth on the back of that inclination, as it was called, in the Books of Enoch. When Books of Enoch were translated in 1827, the best translation we have is that Enoch actually says the Earth inclined on its axis. So we have that record also from our history books. This is Lake Titicaca, as you can see. Was and still is a lot of seawater life in here surviving, and was a point in time where it would have been at sea level, and that would have been a port which ships could have come into prior to the great catastrophe. And later on we find this is a very important site for the colonists who came here from the Indus Valley and from Samaria. This is the Phenombosi chevron here, this one here, and also there. In 6,500 BC, we had a similar kind of impact which hit the Indian Ocean, which is well recorded in the record. These large dunes, if you like to call them, of debris are 600 feet high. And so you can imagine the size of the wave that swept across here from the Indian Ocean and created those in northern Madagascar. At 6,500 BC, we find that there is flooding in the Rift Valley, particularly around Jericho, which is very well recorded from the archaeological record. And we also find in the Sumerian text that this was around the time that they said that Karsag, the great settlement or agricultural and civilization training center, also was destroyed by what they described as a 1,000-year storm, which is logical in vast quantities of water and massive rains, destroying what was very robust, but not robust enough to deal with the problems that came along here, which was 3,000 years after the settlement was first set up. The examples of the Earth's crust at this time being fractured and massive fault zones, there are many of them. The Rift Valley, right the way from Turkey to Malawi, is a clear one, but we have the East Azores fault zone, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge Fault, the Krakow fracture zone here. And when we look at the Azores, you'll see that we have what is called a basalt construction, a flood basalt construction, and they always come up, cool, and collapse. And what we have when we lift this off the seafloor level or lift it up, we have this here, which equates to the island of Atlantis, which O'Brien surveyed as one of the world's top geologists, found a hanging riverbed. And this is the latest Cardiff University sea level data. And as you can see, we have a ring of mountains protecting the Great Plain, and where we were told that the principal city of Atlantis resided here. Just to give you a clue, if you want to go to my website, you can play with that in 3 dimensions and move it around and have a good look at it. Now, this rapid, if you like, end of the last glacial and pretty rapid warming, this gives a general guide to what we know about this climate. And this is what Peter was talking about, these preceding troughs and peaks. Where we are now is here, which isn't really quite as high as that medieval warm period. It's certainly not as high as the Roman period, warming period, when we had very good vines growing up almost into the Scottish borders. And we have, going back to this very important date, which is the Holocene climatic optimum. This is about 4,200. It's when sea levels were a lot higher than they are now, and when an area of the Sumerian plains were flooded, and that flood is a flood that was attributed to Noah, who happened to be a king in that area at that time. And this is where the Noah names comes from, when the Hebrews put the records together for their particular religion, or might say our particular religion, from the Sumerian records. And much of the biblical texts are based on the Sumerian and other records. Very important point. But this is when we have the people coming into the Somerset levels, great sophistication. This is when people are clearing and burning Dartmoor, where they're coming into side fields in Ireland, and we're getting a movement of peoples, a colonization from the area of Sumeria, because at this particular long favourable period of time, there was a big population. The city of Uruk was nearly up to 50,000 people at this point, and they went abroad and colonized, and I'm going to come to that a little later. So this is a very, very important point, and also an important point to realize that much warmer than now, and quite a lot, maybe anything between 20 and 30 meters higher sea levels at this particular point in time than we have now. But it's a subject that needs to be properly researched. This is the latest evidence we have of our earliest farming, and it all centers in this area here. And this is in this last year this has been produced. And every single site where there were agricultural remains, all the analysis points to the 10 probable centers of origin being these black dots here, which all surround our center point of the Garden of Eden site here, Aswad, which is quite close to Damascus. We find the chickpea up here, the chickpea down here, the wheats, the barleys, the peas, the beans, the vetches, the domestication of animals, the figs, chickpea, all our basic crops are riding in this area. And this is the latest science to say that if you want to see where our earliest farming site was, that's where you go, into this area here. And many people have been quite specific in saying it must have been a single center, and other people have said, apart from being a single center, it would have been somewhere between Jericho and Damascus, and that's where we're going to look for this site. This is Professor David Harris from the UCL, and he makes the point that domesticated barley and wheat are present outside the range of their wild progenitors at Murghar in western Pakistan by 5,300 BC, and the early Neolithic package of cereals, pulses, goats and sheep appears at numerous sites on the Thessalian plain in eastern Greece during the 7th millennium BC. Thus, the evidence as a whole points strongly to the conclusion that agriculture developed throughout Western Eurasia, not as a result of a series of independent shifts from foraging to farming, but a process of diffusion from a single area of origin in the Near East. These are the dates for agriculture around the world, and the continuity of crops, which is a very important point. That stability in climate and the relative stability we've had since that, what we call the very cold Younger Dryas and then the warming up. We've had a stability of continuation of most crops, although there may well have been wheat and barley in the Americas which were not continued for one reason or another, probably climate reasons. But we have northern China, 9,000 BP before present, southern China, 8,000, central Mexico, 5,750, the Peruvian Andes, 5,250, eastern North America, 5,250 years BP, Africa, 4.5, and two wild cards, which are Papua New Guinea and Amazonia, which still give us dates after this original starting of farming in the Near East. This is the comments about wheat. While organic artifacts of wheat have not been and may not ever be found in the New World, analysis of inorganic opaline plant microfossils called pytholiths may yet reveal evidence of pre-Columbian wheat cultivation, in other words, very early wheat cultivation. So I'm not going to read all that, but this is quite an important point, is that we're now beginning to look at all the plant evidence and get a much clearer picture of what actually was happening with our agriculture. And agriculture is one of the ways in which we can trace our particular civilization and look for the founders of that civilization. This is very interesting. This is the oldest town in the world, or recorded as the oldest town in the world, at Jericho in the Rif Valley. This is the Tel al-Sultan and the Spring al-Sultan, which is still running as strongly now as it was 9,500 BC. This is the excavation trench which Kathleen Kenyon dug in 1954-55 and did marvelous work in getting dates and records here. And they found a massive ditch, a rock-cut ditch, a stone wall, and towers, which Kathleen Kenyon herself says would not disgrace, to such a quality, it would not disgrace a medieval castle. And we're talking 9,500 BC of that level of technology. This was very important because irrigation of crops possible from this point. You can see them there today. You also had a very important point for gathering salt or collecting salt, which is a crucial component in the preservation of meats, and also a source of bitumen too, which was widely used in house building for the next 6,000 or 7,000 years. This is a lovely diagram or picture. I'm not quite sure where it came from. It was a reconstruction drawing by Miss M. Ratcliffe under Professor Garstang's supervision of the brick-walled city of Jericho as it appeared when Joshua first saw it. And I'm sure it's based on archaeology. But what I want you to look at closely is this rock-cut ditch. Part of the massive ancient rock-cut ditch can be clearly seen on this image, which originally circled the original settlement. And this is staggering because it's bedrock, extremely hard, and we have no idea how people at 9,500 BC were able to create such an extraordinary structure. There is another more simplistic drawing of Jericho with the same ditch and wall around, and it looks very much as though it was designed to cope with flood conditions, far more likely to involve the problems of flood than it was about people breaking in and stealing things, although the grass huts weren't quite what was going on inside. And there is the spring itself. Now at Jericho we have really the first sign of central organization, and this is the token system, the first code, the earliest system of writing used for transmitting information. These are samples of the clay counters used in the Near East from about 9000 BC, and these were found in the hearths of the earliest farmers and villages. And this marvelous work was done by Denise Schmant-Besserat, and she puts it in her book before writing Volume 1. What happened was a farmer would make his own particular mark and put on one of these tokens the equivalent of 3 bags of grain or 5 sheep. And he would have made 2 sets. One he'd keep himself for his own records, and the other he'd take into the central community, where he would be paying a percentage of his produce in tax, if you like, to the community. So this is quite sophisticated social order on the simple, straightforward, practical scale at these very early dates. Earliest writing we've got 6,600 BC here on tortoise shells in China, which is an interesting point, and I'm going to touch on China. And they gradually develop into these clay tablets, which have got ears of wheat and diagrams which describe animals, and cut marks and ring marks, which are the numbers of the various goods. And 95% of the Sumerian records were for accounting purposes. They were meticulous in recording everything extremely accurately. And you can imagine that if a farmer is going to deliver 5 sheep and 3 bags of grain to the central community, that system had to be protected for all it was worth, so that there was law and order and social functioning at its best. This is the fig, the domestication of the fig, the oldest recorded domesticated fig found near Karsag. It was actually found at Gilgal 1, which is 8 miles north of Jericho. And it proved to be a domesticated mutant, selectively propagated by local people at that date, 11,400 years ago. In this variety of fig, known as a parthenocarpic, the fruit develops without insect pollination and is prevented from falling off the tree, allowing it to ripen. This edible fig would not have survived if not for human intervention. And I shall be talking about intervention because we all talk about evolution on one side, creationism on the other. And I'm suggesting that both those camps can be reconciled from the point of view that we had an advanced civilization, and a part of all the work that's being gone through within our talk this weekend has been of the existence of an advanced civilization which was capable of wonderful deeds and wonderful things and wonderful scientific skills. This is where the Karsag site is here in the Rashaya Basin, north of Mount Hermon, east of Damascus, west of Damascus. And Damascus used to be called Esh Shams, after Shamesh, which is an Akkadian word for Shamesh. And it is my belief, and I'm sure O'Brien's belief, that the shaman we talk about today are descended from this teacher of wisdom in the ancient world at that very early date. Here we have Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Baalbek. We have a whole history here. Lake Tiberias or Lake Galilee, in the 5 intermontane valleys running into Lake Galilee, we find some of the oldest sophistication, older than 8,000 years, wonderful houses, wonderful sophistication within the archaeology, which is only really being uncovered now, and we've seen in the last 5 years. Now, fortunately, our ancestors, in being very thorough in recording bags of grain and sheep, had a writing system. And the writing system was very straightforward and simple, picture signs for the ordinary people, which was very easy for the spatial memory to cope with, as the road signs are today if we drive from here to Greece, for example. But they also had an in-house alphabet, as they called it, which was the speedy writing of Enoch. And I've already dealt with that subject in previous talks, but it's very important to realize that there was a system of writing which was pictorial, and there was a in-house for the elite, even amongst the Druids, the Phoenician letters or the Aleph Beg, and we can date that Aleph Beg back at least to 2800 to the sign of Sargon I, or the correct dates for Sargon I. But here, if we look at this diagram, we see the cylinder seals, we see ordinary seals, and here actually they're making and carving unbelievably competent, if you like, incredible skill, hard, very hard stone, designed to be produced perfectly, to roll out on a piece of clay print. One of the earliest ways of printing things, although I think a simple stamp or a seal probably preceded even the cylinder seals. And here is an image of a scribe wearing what is best described as a feather skirt, which in a hot Samaria might have been quite a nice thing to have to wear, and using natural feathers. And we're going to come to people wearing feathered coats, and whether they got wings or not in a minute or two. Within the tablets found in Nippur is this man's golden age, which describes a blissful and unrivaled state of man in an era of universal peace before he had learned to know fear and before the confusion of tongues. Very similar to the Genesis texts. I'm not going to dwell on some of these slides because I've got a long way to go and a lot to say. This was a key tablet. This was found in the same Nippur collection. It was found by the Pennsylvania University expedition to Nippur in 1896, 97, 98. We come on to 1963, and Samuel Noah Kramer is saying, nevertheless, much that was unknown or misunderstood at the time of its publication has now gradually become clarified, and there is good reason to hope that in the not-too-distant future we'll see the better part of its contents ready for translation. And this is what O'Brien did. He took this tablet and translated it, and that's what the genius of the few, one of the key features in the genius of the few, is how he went about that translation and how he successfully translated the story, of which there are 11 tablets and a great deal of material, all in the book, about Karsag. And Karsag, where heaven and earth meet, the heavenly assembly, the great sons of Anu descended. Anu being a name which was used much later, at about 1500 BC. The many wise ones, the lord of the granary, the cattle shed, the well, the irrigation channels had not been dug, the lord of the plough, all these farming issues. The faithful Lord Ugmash had not yet taken observations of the movements of the sun, and we find Ugmash coming down to Shamash. Mankind learned the great shining from the great shining ones. They set things in order. So here we have this extraordinary story, which is down to earth, practical story, which was translated originally in a religious way and believed to be incantations and hymns. But as long as when you begin to look at this material as serious, accurate records of the Sumerians, it all begins to make sense. O'Brien went to look for this site, and he had additional clues from the books of Enoch. Now, Enoch is the Hebrew word for Thoth or Hermes, and we know not much more than that there was a great body of historical records from great historians, which seem to be come together within the books of Enoch, but it was incredibly difficult to translate and understand. And the Reverend Charles, in about 1880, O'Brien felt had made the best job, and then O'Brien took over this task from Charles of looking at things which he could see were practical things that people in 1890 wouldn't have expected from religious texts. The books of Enoch were taken out of the church canon by St. Jerome in 296 AD. They still are incredibly important, and we still perhaps haven't understood more than a fraction of what is there about our history and our past from perhaps one of our great historians. This is the Garden of Eden site. O'Brien looked at all the various options, and this is the one that fitted the bill. Here is Mount Hermon. This is different satellite images at different times of the year, and this is the area which would have been an ancient lake bed, and this is a gully, if you like, the Wadi Nirab, where all the water went to at the time that this was occupied and successful. But what happened with this 1,000-year storm is that the reservoir and the watercourse and the facilities here were destroyed, and it was never reoccupied. So we have a time capsule here of our history, of our ancestors and what they were doing to look at. And I'm talking to Edinburgh University about flying over here in a helicopter to do a geophysical survey, an X-ray survey from the air, which now can be done to investigate what was going on and know where to locate our cores for sampling pollen, etc. And also, Desmond is going out to this area at the end of this month, and we hope to have photographs of the Great Watercourse to see whether it was rock cut like the Jericho Watercourse, and look at all the stonework that may be left and all the debris that may remain from that great catastrophe. This is what Genesis says, and this is a particularly important point for everybody within the church to look at. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, and a river. And I'm suggesting here that this is the Great Watercourse, and this word river was mistranslated. And a watercourse went out of Eden to water the garden. If you say a river went out of Eden to water the garden, it doesn't make quite so much sense as watercourse. And from whence it was parted. Now rivers, when they go downstream, are not parted. Tributaries come into them. But what parts rivers and water are sluices. And became into 4 heads. This is the words from Genesis. 4 heads. What are 4 heads? And I would suggest, and I think O'Brien would put this point quite clearly, that they were irrigation channels. The name of the first is Pison. The name of the second river, I should say irrigation channel or channel, is Gihon. The name of the third river is Hiddekel. That is which goeth towards the east of Assyria. That's an interesting clue, because Assyria wasn't invented until about 1600 BC. So it shows that this is several thousand years after the actual event. And the fourth river, or watercourse, is called Euphrates. Now, I've said here, the names possibly used for rivers much later. So these may well have been called those names in the original Garden of Eden, but they were used, the same names were used for rivers later on, which is a pretty logical thing to do if you colonize the area. What you have here is a reservoir, as described in the Karsag epics, a great watercourse here, taking all the surplus water from Mount Hermon away into the Wadi Nirab, and then an area here, the whole very beautiful, fertile basin, which would have been a lake bed. They may have even drained that lake bed to get their garden. And here are speculative placements, as described in Genesis, the books of Enoch, and also in the Karsag epics, with Enlil's great house, which I'm going to come back to here. And this is where we may find a lot of very interesting information in a village which now resides here, because there's a pond right on top of the hill which has to come in from a big aqueduct, which is the kind of technology saw the ancients doing. And we may well find, you can see the actual footings for the dam, outlines of that on the Google images. And so this is our area on the map, and this is what O'Brien puts into the book at the back of the room, called The Genius of the Few. Now, when I wanted to find out more about this area, Google came to the rescue. And this is what Google provided us with, a perfect image from above of the great watercourse, which you wouldn't see on the ground. It's there to be seen, exactly as you would expect along the watershed. And this is a great watercourse, as they described it in the Karsak text. They wondered whether it was strong enough. They worried day and night over the amount of work it was taking to build it. They knew they had to make it strong. And I believe that's where it's still there, and it can be seen from the air, and it's massive. And so the river going out of Eden, this is where the settlement was. So the river going out of Eden was a great watercourse going out of Eden from the dam, overflow from the dam, and the four heads were the irrigation channels into this area here to irrigate that flat lake bed. Another image here was the dam, and then the overflow went down here, and you can see it clearly, clear as a whistle. Close up, and here you've got water coming from a dam this way, and then on the other side of the hill, it looks like another water channel or watercourse, almost the same size, was built to collect water from over this side, and that would have been to collect additional water for irrigation. The big problem they would have had would have been getting enough water during dry summers to keep this settlement going, because all that early agriculture required irrigation in order to have control over it. There's no point having sophisticated seeds and doing all the work that a farmer does if he cannot control irrigation. And irrigated farming is as important today as it was then. And during the summer months, we know at these dates, 9,500 BC, there was very little summer precipitation. And so irrigation depended on collecting that surplus of winter water, which was only really available on that Mount Hermon range because of the climatic conditions at the time and the geography of the area. Here is the one lady we've talked about, the lady Ninkarsag, and she says in the Karsak epics, with this settlement will come prosperity, an enclosed reservoir, a water trap should be established, the good land is full of water, because of the water the food will be plentiful. Here we have ancient Mari on the middle Euphrates, and the statue that I've just shown you here. This statue was discovered. This statue was discovered in Mari, in the center of a 200-acre palace complex, or administrative area, sacred area complex. Temple was a word that evolved from taimon, or taimen, and taimen meant a sacred area, and the sacred areas were always to the gods, or the children of the gods, dedicated to them at a later stage, and then they became the temples for priests, and then they become the cathedrals for the priests. But originally they were sacred areas to the gods who had delivered civilization and all the wonderful things that people thrived from their intervention. Now, I'm coming to the serpent knowledge. We all know about Adam and Eve tempted by the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Well, of course, the serpent wasn't a snake. We put that on later. We bolted the snake on later. We have to get that absolutely clear in our minds. All the snake cults and all the snake stories are everything all been bolted on after the event, particularly when people wanted to produce their own religions and version of events and wanted to denigrate the old order. We even have St. Patrick going into Ireland to banish the snakes, but he was really banishing the serpent knowledge of the Druids. And the Druids said, we are the serpents, we are the Druids. And this is where this comes from. The root of the word serpent, SRP, SRF, and I suggest you get the book and look at it if you want more detail, but these are roots of the words serve, perform a duty, survive, survey, syrup, a term used in early medicine, surplice, white covering used in Druid and Christian ceremonies. And the closest association was seraph, one of the group of angels known in plural as seraphim. The Hebrew word rapha meant healer, surgeon or doctor. The term ser, S-E-R, meant a higher being or guardian. So always remember that when you say sir to somebody. Hence, a reasonable deduction that the seraphim were a corps of medical angels. The Egyptian god Seraphis has medical associations. His temple at Memphis, which contained a hospital, is called the Serapheum. We also had a Seraphim library too, which was burnt down by Bishop Theodosius in 296. In addition, Seraphon was an eminent physician of Alexandria in the 3rd century AD, a name derived from his profession. It must be acknowledged that the term serpent had wider associations with wisdom and wise men and women. Very, very important basic material, which really does, I hope, knock on the head all the conspiracy theories and disruptions to the records, which started thousands of years ago in confusing these wise men and women with a snake equivalent as it is. So we have Ninkarsag. She's actually called the Serpent Lady, Goddess of Irrigation. We're talking about Ninkarsag, Ninil, wrong name, Gabriel, governor, Gabriel meaning governor, which relates to the Latin gubernator. With the modern equivalent, Ninkarsag was governor of the Garden of Eden, also said to be in charge of the serpents and the cherubim. Karsag epic number 3, where Enil says to the gatekeeper, this is the gate of the Garden of Eden, "This is thy lady, thy exalted lady Ninil. Where water cultivates, she commands in my name." The name serpent comes through in the translations of the earliest texts in terms of archangels being described as two-eyed serpents, or angels described as one-eyed serpents, both also being called Ananage or Ananuki. The archaic form of the Sumerian language, the serpent also had Mush, Messiah, Anointed One, evolved into 3 separate ideograms, the first of which had 4 attached meanings: a serpent, dog's tongue plant, the god Shaka, and the god Ser. Second expressed meanings which included the goddess Ishtar of Eric, the priest or one cleansed, the god Shushinak, splendor and magnificence. The third continued the list of goddess names with goddess Inanna, goddess Ishtar. I believe that following with all the names and all the different languages in different parts of the world, we find Ninkarsag becomes Inanna, Ishtar, Isis, Astarte, Ceres, Kali in India, Ka in Indonesia, in South America, Kotaliku, where she's described as the serpent lady rather than the lady of the serpents. And it's very important to see the way that these names have changed over time, because when we find Kotaliku in Mexico at the time of Cortez, she's a 9-foot-high basalt statue, and people are having their hearts ripped out in her name. So there's a great denigration over distance and time of the original story. Historically, the serpent became associated with rejuvenation, the healing arts, the symbol of the caduceus, a badge of the medical profession, wisdom. Be ye therefore as wise as serpents, Matthew, shrewdness. Now the serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild beasts, and Genesis. The devil, a derivation of the temptation of Eve. Lawrence Gardner's 2 latest books will be out soon. One is on the Antichrist, which tells you that the whole story of the devil was manufactured by man to control man. And he got a history of God, which now includes much of the material that I'm talking about now. This is the hierarchy. I'm going through this very quickly. I've got a whole sheet of paper at the back of the room on this, but this gives you a lot of the clues as where these names came from and how things evolved. And the important one is wisdom and law, which was Utu, Ugmash, who we saw earlier, Shamash, Ogimus, Ogma, Og, and maybe on to Lug, but that's another story. Michael, captain of the guard, a title. Sariel, representative of the Watchers were represented here. Remiel, supervisor of instructions. And the Lord of the Spirits, Lord of the Cultivation, or Ho, Enil. He's thought to be Lord of the Wind, but it was a mistranslation of a plant pot, which could only mean one thing: cultivation or farming. In the hierarchy, you had the angels, or the one-eyed serpents, Engeli, which were the lords of the cultivation, which was the angels involved in agriculture. Ab, Ka, Lu, bright farmers from the enclosure. Lu, bright, Ka, enclosure, part of Ka, Sag. Sag meant head, Ka meant enclosure. And you find the Jinn, the June, the Genie, Malek, Hashanim, 2 after-known serpents, Druids, all in that line from angels. So the angels were great teachers and craftsmen. They were people who helped people through tradition, and they're still around to help us today, and I wouldn't want to take that away from anybody. Watchers were watchers with watching with both eyes, watching or a similar thing. The one-eyed serpent, the angel, the two-eyed serpent, the archangel, and then you've got the three-faced people who were really watching, or the two-faced people who were watching. They were categories of describing people who were very intelligent and bright, and we're going to come on to that. And here you have, O'Brien deals with this here now, with Ugmash, with the Ugmash tablet here, And he may have been very big and tall. We can come to that later. They were tall and large, and there's a description at the end of what most people thought they looked like. But there is the rod and the ring, the standard unit of measure, the rolled measuring tape, symbols of authority given to the king so that he could go out and measure out the houses and measure out the fields when he went off with 150 or 200 craftsmen and their families to start another city-state somewhere else. The Sumerian igi could mean eye or face. Consequently, the inscription could equally read a two-faced serpent or a two-eyed. I think both of them apply, because I think the two-faced meant that you were two-eyed and you were actually looking in two directions, which meant you were getting all four eyes working, if you see what I mean. And so I think, and then we have the evidence of Jason, the Roman sun god, who was the equivalent of Udmash, was depicted in statues as a figure with two faces. And I think it was a description of his superior knowledge. Here we have Enel, and here Sitchin says that's a trident, but it's not. It's a plough. It comes up time and time again. And here we have Enel with the plough. He was the lord of the plough, lord of the hoe, key figure in these times. And here we see some of the very earliest Proto-Sumerian writing. Phaistos disc is the divinity symbol of Zeus, starting in the middle, and it's about the great lord and the seven lords and the oxen breaking out of the field and trampling over the beehives. And a whole pastoral disaster and what they all do, and the headman being called, and absolute chaos, and then eventually they all gather up the animals and everything's fine. But it's a very complex computer disk because it's divided into segments which are all about their 360-day year, to which they added holidays to make up the extra days, and the way in which the Aubrey holes at Stonehenge work. And so it is a lovely story read from this direction here, but it may be read differently the other way, but it's certainly in compartments which make it a very complex mathematical tool or device which was printed out to people in the very earliest times. And it must date to the very earliest vertical picture signs, which takes us back way before 5000 BC. But what is so important is this is about the seven lords, the great lady and the great lord, and the phrasing and the way the language is used is reminiscent of the Karsag epics. It's clearly the same story or a story about what was going on in Karsag. This is just a brief reminder that the cuneiform were vertical images so that people could very easily understand that was a head. If it was a king, it had a plumed thing on the top. If it was a head man, he had an earring in his cheek. All sorts of interesting variations on a head. But the system was turned on its side, and then it became a picture, rectangular lines drawn with a wedge on clay, a reed wedge on clay. And here we get the cuneiform evolving. And of course, by the time we get to here, it's almost impossible for anybody to translate it unless they know the background. And for Christian O'Brien to understand the cuneiform and translate the cuneiform, he had to go back to the oldest picture language, which is very easy and clear to understand. And that's how he was able to do it. And the top people in the world will tell you, if you want to translate the Sumerian cuneiform accurately, you have to go back to the beginning. And the problem here has resulted in a massive amount of misunderstanding, mistranslation, particularly when people start from this end with the Babylonian and Akkadian material, which has misled so much of what we read in the books about Sumer and the story of Sumer. Here we have, if you go to the Assyrian room in the British Museum, then there's these most marvellous statues and much more besides. And if you haven't been to the Assyrian room in the British Museum, please go and look at your ancestors and admire their work and admire all the work and everything that's on display. This man is holding a Mesopotamian fallow deer, very clear accuracy as to what a Mesopotamian fallow deer looks like today. But if that is a Mesopotamian fallow deer, as I'm saying it is, he must be at least 10 foot tall. Now this is where a lot of people walk out of the room, but it's very important to realize that if we lost a very large chunk of our atmosphere, this great catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age, then we would find that people who were living in that much denser atmosphere would have been bigger. And certainly we had very large animals with the massive mammoths, and many other species were of a great size. And when people put fish in tanks and put them under the same kind of atmospheric pressure that we would have had them, or something like it, they find the fish grow to twice the size and live twice as long. So this is a very interesting bit of science to support the idea that there were giants in those days. And O'Brien makes the point, this is Genesis again, and God made every kind of wild beast, every cat, and every kind of reptile, and saw what we could. He did actually make them because he domesticated them and produced them very efficiently. O'Brien was more modest. He allowed him were not making animals, but caring for them and tending them, as all good farmers do. But really, current genetic knowledge now recognises the application of advanced scientific knowledge and practice in the domestication of wild plants and animals from around 9000 BC, in what would appear to be, from the evidence, the restart of civilization after a major catastrophe. In the current confrontational debate between creationists and evolutionists, both parties need to address their misunderstanding of past events by looking at the historical record. This is about an advanced civilization. Our ancestors were more advanced than we are. And it's very important to get that in our minds. And they were our ancestors. And we can find all the clues, and we're going to look at some of them now. Ab-Ka-Lu here with the wings. This was purely a symbol of divinity, which was to identify this man from an Assyrian king or whatever. Here we have people, noble people, were provided and dressed in feather coats. And look at that beautiful, beautiful feather coat from a Maori princess. And remember, the Maoris arrived after the Celts. The Celts were in New Zealand, or the people from Britain or Northern Europe were in New Zealand before the Maoris arrived. And that's the latest and most interesting evidence. But these feather coats were the tradition. Enoch says, when he was taken up to the top of Mount Hermon, their clothes were remarkable, being purplish, with the appearance of feathers, and on their shoulders were things that I can only describe like golden wings. And I would suggest we have to look at the fact that they were wearing feathered clothes. We've got the feathered serpent, remember, all sorts of clues about this. And the wings were added later for different reasons. The only reference we have to wings in Greece is the goddess Nike, who was described as a divine messenger. So if you're going to be a divine messenger, you need wings of some kind to get around. And here she is, celebrating with Poseidon. Here we have the sacred basket and the pine cone, or the maize cob, or whatever you like to call it. Dan will have some ideas on this, which we can talk about later. Here you have somebody else, similar mould, with a goat, a similar situation, a goat making this chap very, very tall. Here we have the divine triad in Tel Halaf, man, man, woman, and that's the gap looking up at them, not look at the sides of them. And that was at Tel Halaf. Here are the earliest models of people at Ain Ghazal in Jordan, 8000 BC, and whether the first divinities or whether they were images of our gods and our ancestors. Look at the eyes and the technology creating those eyes. And a similar thing here. These are said to be the Anunnaki Council. And they always made the most important man taller, and if you were less important. So Ninkar is up here, look, on a par with maybe An or Enlil, I'm not sure which. But this is these statuettes are found in most of the towns in Mesopotamia, or some of the towns, they probably are in most of the towns, out of respect for these people. They were key figures who lived on for thousands of years, and their importance lived on for thousands of years because they were recognized as being the gods, and their good deeds and works were revered by everybody. See exactly the same technology here, and that's in Peru. The Greeks had exactly the same story of the Hesperus, as they call it, Aiden's Greek counterpart, the vast depiction of the serpent and the apple tree. This is Noah, who was involved in the flood, a flood at 4200 in Sumer, which is a local Sumerian affair. And here is Heracles demanding to know where he can find the enlightenment of the serpent. And Noah's bottom half is to indicate he came through the flood. So they wanted to get back to the serpent knowledge at this time. They'd begun to lose it at about 4200 BC. For a number of years after the flood, God's awesome and decisive invention in human affairs remained fresh in the minds of Noah's descendants, and the way of Cain remained dormant. Then, gradually, a yearning for the serpent wisdom began to take hold. Similar story about the gods, and this is the Japanese creation story, is virtually identical to the Enuma Elish and the Sumerian material, because we had this migration of the Sumerian people to China and to Japan and their knowledge. And that's a very interesting trail, because the Chinese language and writing is almost identical to the Sumerian. You can see the exact links. And there's a book called Sumerian Chinese Lexicon, which was written by Charles Ball, and it makes it perfectly clear how strong these links were. These are what we call the Anunnaki or the Anunnaki. O'Brien believes that the right way to write it is Anunnaki rather than Anunnaki. The great gods foregather, death and life they determine, but death they do not reveal, from the Epic of Gilgamesh. There may be a deeper meaning here, I don't know. These are the grave objects that Leonard Woolley found in the royal graves of Ur, and that is a wonderful artist representation by Monsieur Hergé, who did this for National Geographic magazine before the Second World War, and the whole series of paintings. This is the so-called death pit. It's not a death pit in many other descriptions, and I think that needs looking at again, but I've only really put this in to show you the size of the cattle. Do you see the cattle? They're quite small. They're like Dexters, our modern Dexter, the smallest cattle we have, and the horns sticking out here, and key transport and pulling things. And these were supposed to be chariots, but they're clearly a combination of chariot and farm cart, I think. They wouldn't have, they would have all been called to go and fight to defend the farms, and they would have used the farm carts to take the troops on the way. That was going on in my childhood in Cirencester Park with a team of oxen. They've got bigger now, as you can see, much bigger, short-horn cross Herefords. And you can see the man here with the skill to be able to go out each day with his team of oxen and plough a straight furrow. How many people could do that today? But this links us with them, if you see what I mean. Our agriculture remains virtually unchanged over the whole of this period of time, including those domesticated crops and the domesticated animals which they gave us. Something like Enoch, we were all looking this morning and yesterday about who's doing this measuring, who's setting up these right angles, who's doing all this fantastic calculation. And we got the clues. With Enoch, I saw that in those days how long cords were being given to the angels, and they took themselves to wing and flew and went towards the north. And I asked an angel, saying unto him, why have these taken cords and gone off? And he said to me, they've gone to measure. So these are the kind of things that needed to be explained clearly in the translations, and they're more obvious now. And the reference, this is O'Brien's comment, the reference to measuring in relation to surveying is a homely one for the senior author, which is O'Brien. While surveying in the high country of South Iran, he was often asked by curious tribesmen what he was doing with his plane table, his rangefinder and his linen tapes. The only answer that could be reasonably given to them, with no concept of mapping, was I am measuring. The other story, totally separate from Enoch, is Canaan, Canaan stone from Jubilees. And this is Noah's son. This is an extraordinary story where Noah's son is frightened to tell Noah about having found out about the watchers measuring. And he found a writing which former generations had carved on a rock. And he read what was thereon, and he described it, and sinned owing to it, for it contained the teaching of the watchers, in accordance with which they used to observe the omens of the sun and moon and the stars, and all the signs in heaven. And he wrote it down and said nothing about it, for he was afraid to speak to Noah about it, lest he should be angry with him on account of it. Little clues, lots of valuable information in there. Then we look at we know the evidence that we have is that we have zodiacs going back to the year dot, literally. The oldest we believe is the Thendra zodiac, but there was a Sumerian zodiac which must have been older. But this is from Paul Laviolette's book, which is a very important book, Earth Under Fire. I'm going to just talk a little bit about that next on the next slide. But this is an incredible, was on the ceiling. It was replaced on a later temple, but the ancient temple of Dendra had this on it, and when that ancient temple crumbled or was destroyed, the zodiac was replaced and put on the roof. And it gives all these crucial dimensions, which we were looking at Stonehenge and the early material, which I won't go into because it'll take time. But it's worth a study in itself to compare the knowledge which was being displayed 3, 4, 5,000 BC with the knowledge that we have from places like Stonehenge. And if people like archaeologists these days are not going to look at this evidence, then some of them aren't going to get anywhere at all. But I think the students are asking the questions, and getting this material out to a large number of people will be incredibly valuable. Paul Viollet uses this in his book, Earth Under Fire, to show that the Sagittarian arrow and the tail of Scorpion is pointing to what in fact is the galactic centre. And this is where we believe this superwave or snake comes from. And we haven't had much time to go into that. And Paul Viollet's work is very important. But the ancients knew where the galactic centre was. And that's incredible, and it's proven from looking and analysing the Dendrozodiac and the other early zodiacs. And this was a key point that Paul Viollet makes in his book about there having existed in the past an advanced civilization. Now we go to Enoch again, and we're looking about irrigation. And Enoch is there to measure it, and water gauges, and everything to do with the practicalities of supplying water to the plantations in the Garden of Eden. Evidence there. And Enoch's talking here about studying the stars, the sun and the moon, and astronomy. Some of these angels study the movements of the stars and the sun and the moon and record the peaceful order of the world. Other angels there undertake teaching and give instruction in clear, melodious voices. There are archangels who are promoted over the ordinary angels. They are responsible for recording and studying the fauna and flora in both the highlands and the lowlands. There are angels who study the seasons and the years, others who study the rivers and the seas, others who study the fruits of the earth and the plants and herbs that give nourishment to man and beasts. And there are angels who study mankind and record the behaviour of men and how they live. I'm just going to deal with this thing. And there are angels who study mankind and record the behaviour of men and how they live. And O'Brien says, this passage goes even further and provides a rational explanation for the religious concept of the recording angel and the writing down of the good and bad deeds of men. From this account, we can now understand that these angel investigators were only observing mankind from anthropological, genetic, and psychological viewpoints. They were not concerned with guilt or original sin, which can now be seen as a superimposition by later misunderstanding religious interpreters. Very, very important. So this record of the sixth place of Enoch in Eden is the fullest statement that we have anywhere of the actual daily activities of the angels Anunnaki in the settlement of Eden Kasa. And the extraordinary conclusion which we find that we cannot avoid is that these activities appear to be compatible with the scientific interests of an exploration expedition into unknown country. Its members appear to have been studying every facet of science which such an expedition would require, from geology to botany and from astronomy to anthropology. Now, soon after the settlement of Karsak, we find that these people, groups, teams comprising of a leader or a king, together with angels and watchers, moved to other suitable locations to start city-states. We believe that Baalbek, Jericho, where Enki was in control of the lowlands and most of the area of the land, Enki may have been responsible for that rock-cut ditch at Jericho, On, Ebla, Olympus, and Catalhayak, were followed by other settlements such as Persepolis and Mergar, and even involving groups going to the Americas and other parts of the world over a period of time. But they clearly didn't take long to get established and start other settlements, hence the various stories. Here we have a very important quote from an Akkadian tablet, remember a lake tablet, 2,000 years ago, sorry, 2000 BC. All we great Anunnaki decided together on a rule. Anu and Adad would rule the highlands. I, Enor, would rule the lowlands. So this is Enor speaking, the lord of cultivation, the man who ruled Karsak. Adad is almost certainly the same as Hadad. Dad may well be where Dad comes from, because Ninkarsak was called Ma, Mama, Pasha, Mama, Mother Goddess, and you'll find all these connections. And so here we have Enor looking after the area of Karsak, Enki's off around the world, and Anu and Hadad rule the highlands. And the highlands in this context are Baalbek, at the head of the two rivers. And we know from the records that the great gods administered and gave justice at the head of the two rivers. And it was assumed that the two rivers were the Tigris and the Euphrates, when in fact the two rivers were clearly the Orontes and the Litani. And of course Baalbek has extraordinary large stones, etc., which I've dealt with in other talks. But I've just found this information about Asher in Sumer, and this is a double temple of Anu and Adad. Hadad was Jupiter. This is where we get the name Jupiter from, and Anu is almost certainly Zeus. But you've got these connections, so that thousands of years later, they're having administrative buildings, if you like, mosques, whatever you like to call them, this is what a mosque is, administrative buildings put up in memory of them. That is the Baalbek platform. That is the water supply, rather like Jericho, coming down this conduit here into a pond here, so they had a good supply of water right from the start. And here you have a massive platform. In Egypt, we find On is settled here, and just as the suburb of Cairo now, and the hieroglyphic name of On was Anu, in fact, An or Anu. Here we have evidence of water originally being in this western desert area. Peter was saying how the Sahara was lush with vegetation, and you have Siwa, very important site here, Fayum. I believe they were pumping water from Giza and from Thebes to keep this operation going here. It's geologically possible to do that. And this is where a lot of the latest very exciting finds about the very earliest Egyptians are coming from. And of course many people will tell you that the Egyptians and the Berbers, the whole civilization of Africa was one great civilization at the early times, and their god was An, their principal god was An, same person we're talking about. A little bit of excitement here for those of you who are interested in GM. Cheetahs are the clearest example of a species that could not possibly have been selectively bred by humans. One of the earliest domesticated cats. It is a unique hybrid of cats and dogs. The skeleton is mostly that of a cat, but it sits like a dog. It's a unique flexion in the spine that neither cats nor dogs have, which lets it be the top sprinter in the animal kingdom, 60 miles an hour. To stabilize high-speed turns, instead of soft cat pads and retractable claws, it has tough dog's pads and permanently extended dog's claws. Its fur is dog hair, but it spots the cat hair. Most stunningly, every cheetah has the same DNA. They're clones. These are the kinds of settlements you have from the very earliest times, and even some of these even predate the Karsak settlement. So you've got a level of sophistication existing in this area at that time from the survivors from this global catastrophe. It's important to realise that, and this is on the very important part of Murraybet, which is down the bottom here, where you find agriculture literally coming in. That you've got the tribal people here taking antelope for their food, and with 100 years they've converted completely to farming. And this is one of the surprises in the record. And you're finding the seeds, which aren't native to this area, being brought in. And it's a very important part in this spread or diffusion of agriculture. Tel Nebi Mend is marvellous. Peter Pratt, who was with Kenyon at the Jericho excavation, got a paper of his on Tel Nebi Mend Kadesh. And they look as though, from the documents, they look as though they certainly hardly finished the job. They just took one digging area, one down to the lowest level, and got to about 8,000 BC. But you've got these tells all over the whole region, hardly any of them properly excavated. And we know that we've got these great city-states going back thousands of years. This is Mergar above the Indus Valley, and clearly agriculture came here first before it went into the Indus Valley. Very important point. Tepigawa, another famous occupation mound. Look at the lovely view and all this farmland all around it. It would have been a magnificent city-state with lots of agriculture production, typical of what was going on all over the place. A closer view of Tepigawa. Tel Brak, northern Syria. Look at this. That's what's there now, where people have been digging into it. But that's thousands of years of occupation have created that mound. Same again, same kind of situation. Tel Rifat or Arpad, same. Look at the height of that over the plain. This is the Orontes Valley, which goes north from Baalbek out into the Syrian plains. This is where you find Ebla and a lot of other very important ancient cities which have a very, very long history. This is the Royal School of Eurogryph, the remains here, and this I'm going to read to you because this is from an incredible book called The Phoenician Letters by Wilfrid Davis and G. Zur, who translated the Eurogryph tablets. And it says, and this is a teacher to the son of a king at the Royal School in Eurogryph. And we are told that the stars without number that we see in the heavens, each one the progeny, the inhabitants of the heaven, will in their turn populate the heavens to time without end. So the story goes that when a sun or star dies, it goes forth in a piercing flash of light after compressing upon itself until it can press no more, and flies apart in a myriad of particles, each part finding itself a space wherein it can gather from the heavenly soil nourishment for its growth, and due course make itself a world, as our Lord Shamash has done. That is a lovely description of a black hole, and says that a black hole recycles space matter. And this particular statement in the Phoenician letters is on the same page as this teacher to the son of the king is explaining exactly what a compost heap is. So he equates the compost heap with what we do with compost and what's going on in space. 1800 BC. This is what would have been taught in the Druidic academies in the ancient schools of the time. That's the Syrian desert now. It would have been rather like the savannah. The whole area is dried out, as Peter has said, from this climatic desiccation that started around about 4000 BC and seen the drying out of the Sahara, the drying out of the Arabian desert, and the drying out of the Far desert, which is the desert not far from the Indus Valley. Here is the lovely Tamon, as I call it, administrative building, and always a place at the top. So if the gods came back or was around, they got somewhere to stay. And they were dedicated to these key people and the families. And this is how this tradition goes. They were doing everything out of respect of their gods. And they were, remember, a monotheistic system with a single god at the top, right from the start. The idea that monotheism is something invented later is complete nonsense. Reconstruction of life in Europe. The great mosque in Damascus, on the site of the temple of Baal Haydar. Fantastic building. It was first place that the Islam went to after Muhammad died, and the brass, also copper doors of the earliest part of the building are still there with the eight-petal symbol of the Shining One still in place. That's the map of Syria, and you can see the area that was flooded ran up from the Gulf here up into this area here to Lagesh to Nipper, and that was Noah's flood, much earlier time, a local problem for people in Samaria. The big flood was much, much earlier, 6,000 years earlier. Here is the city of Abraham. Abraham comes into this picture, and this particular town, very important town of Ur, was dedicated to the god Nana, who was son of Enil and Ninkar-Sag, and Ningal, the daughter of Enki. Same again. Two broad canals. Amazing sophistication. They didn't have a problem with overpopulation because they split off like the egg dividing, with somebody who was trained to be a king, 20 years training, picked for the job, took the craftsmen and teachers and their wives and families and started another city-state somewhere else. Here we come back to Nippur, where the library, the remains of a library somewhere here, I'm not quite sure which of these, but here is Enel's Ikur, mountain house. It's called mountain house because that's what Enel originally had, was a mountain house. And here is Inanna's temple here. And if you look at this particular map, this is the ruins of Nippur, and these are the features that they've identified. And what is interesting is Enel is a view over the whole town. And when we get to Karsag, we find Enel's great house here has a view over the Garden of Eden. Interesting tradition and way in which they paid their respects to Enel and had his building where they paid their respects. And these are the achievements of the Indo-European peoples worldwide before the catastrophe. Scotland, we've got a monument to Bel at Logie in the Don Valley. Phoenician inscriptions and solar symbols. Some of the English words derived from Sumerian. I won't go through them all, but you've got 94 words there which are exactly the same in English as they were in Sumerian, so that's where the words came from. And Waddell actually says that all the important words in ancient English, in Old English, over half the words were Sumerian originated. Then we have the identical text in the Indus Valley and Easter Island, identical text. And you find these same texts again in the Americas. This is our worldwide colonization by the Indo-European people. This is the pig's dish, as it's called in Peru. It was found near Lake Titicaca. And what's interesting about the pig's dish is that it has Proto-Sumerian language in here, fluent bowl. So before 3000 BC, and maybe even 4000 BC, you've got the Sumerians colonizing Peru and Bolivia. Another statue to confirm the same story here with similar Proto-Sumerian writing to an arco, that lovely lake which I showed you earlier, which was 16,000 feet above sea level. There is a symbol, this is the symbol, it's the same as the petal symbol, but it's in cuneiform much later, which gives you an idea of the date, but it's the key name, the Sumerian, this is the sign set before divine names. This is found by the burials in New Mexico, and it's a pendant amulet of stone from New Mexico bearing the name symbols of Naram Sin, who was the son of Sargon I on one side and a figure on the other. They were everywhere. This is Gary Bilcliffe's fantastic image from the Etruscans, the Etruscan polygonal tower in central Italy. This is the same wonderful, look at this is the Pelagasi, even older, much, much older wall, and there's 5 miles of this wall. And the biggest stones, some of the biggest stones are on the top levels, and it's still there standing in an area of high volcanic activity. Unbelievable technology. Pyramids, Pelagasian pyramid in northern Greece, again by Gary Bilcliffe. We all know about that lovely image from San Semir of the Bosnian Pyramid of the Sun, which I've included because we want to find out a lot more about that because it fits in so important to our whole history, which adds to what we have, I hope, here. Karnak, 60 feet high, and there was a whole row of them. Nan Madal, on their way to South America, you find this fantastic deep sea, almost deep sea port almost, and wonderful structures out of basalt put together. Tremendous, walls up to 20 feet high. That's another tame one, same style, but they've done it a slightly oriental look to it, so it may be people from Vietnam or China even. Immense basalt boulders packed with small prisms. Sashwashram, is the right way to pronounce it, in Peru. Again, massive stones, massive technology. And those stones either side here at the gate of Puma Punka, are between 200 and 300 tons each. And the nearest source of that sandstone is at least 20 kilometres away. And this is what got me onto this route, this wonderful quote from a book I read called Shepherd's Country. An enigma that no current theories of progress are capable of solving is how came the ancients of the Cotswolds to learn their craft so that it reached its apex before it had begun to move through time, and with no instruction in the excellence it achieved, surpassed all that of all ages that came after it. Now this is the craftsmanship of the corbelling and the stone walling at Ballasnap, which is about 3,800 on the Cotswolds, which I believe was an observatory. And dry stone waller, who met Massingham and went up there with Massingham, called A.F. Dudge from Windrush, on the Windrush, which is on the Cotswolds. And he says this about the stonework at Ballasnap, which is near Cleve Hill. I'd rather see a site like that than all the sites of London and anything else. And this was a top man of his craft, looking back to the skills of the ancients, and it tells us so much. Law and order and free will, and this comes back to this attempt to get a moral story here and finish on a moral note. As I mentioned before, Shamash was a Lord of the Rings, and the rings were in fact this conferring of kingship with a roll measuring tape and a measuring rod. And this is to the Hammurabi, the Code of Hammurabi. And on the top of this stele of the Louvre, it says in simple language, these are the edicts of Anu and Enu. The edicts of Anu and Enu had lived on to 1800 BC from that earlier time. Decrees of law issued by Anu and Enu, which include the conferring of kingship. So when Marduk was made king in Sumeria rather than God, his job was to rule in the name and under the laws of Anu and Enu. Very important link for Kupchakism. Again, measuring rod and tape, and as we saw earlier, a detail maps of fields from the Sumerians, great detail, a measurement of 11 fields. They'd measured the fields precisely. And what I would say to you is that the reason they surveyed this country so accurately, around about 4000 BC, because when the colonists were coming from the overpopulation of the Near East or the climate change of the Near East, people who came to Britain were allocated 3 or 5 acres of land and free passage through the country, a tradition that lasts right through to the time of the Romans coming to Britain. And in order to be able to get that allocation of their tax, which is a percentage of your produce, which we talked about a year ago, you needed to have the land accurately measured so that everybody had a fair deal. Crucial. And everybody was entitled to that plot of land. And the Druids, if you were qualified as a Druid, you were allowed a hide of land and free passage through the country. Hence the story of Joseph of Arimathea and his party being given 12 hides of land. That tradition, because Joseph of Arimathea's party coming into Britain were all qualified in the skills that Jesus had taught. And here we have a lovely picture, an image of the king, that this dynasty might not come to an end. King Era-Imati placed the gardener, Enil-Rani, as the substitute figure on his throne. Kingship was crucial. What really was important is that the king set an example to everybody. He had no property, no money. His job was solely to make sure everything worked. And every single person in the country had free will and freedom under the law too, which is crucial, which we don't have today. And here is the king of Ur on his boat with the chair of Ninkarsag with her symbols here, administering justice in the marshlands of Sumer, just like our district commissioners were doing in India 100 or so years ago. Another wonderful image, and this is a description of the goddess of vegetation, which is Ninkarsag, and several other interesting things. I wanted to show that in particular because that is very, very hard stone. And the craftsmanship to do that, to print that, is absolutely staggering. The Tuatha De Danann arriving in Ireland, and the quote here is that the men of science were gods and the laymen no gods, but we have this long tradition of the Tuatha De Danann leading to the Druids and the Druidic traditions, and the Druidic traditions being directly linked with the Tuatha De Danann. Serpent meaning wise man or woman, and very important. In Southern Ireland, there's still a saying, wise as the Tuatha De Danann. The serpent was the subsequent totem of the House of David. They precede the Persian Magi, Egyptian and Canaanite priests, as well as the Levitical, Brahmin and Essene traditions. Annual councils of king and druid advisors to kings took place over the millennia in the original homelands. Good government and peace was a fundamental requirement. Religion, as we know it, did not exist. And O'Brien makes the point about the Druids and such as could make discourses to their scholars concerning the stars and their motions and the magnitude of the heaven and the earth. Back to our astrology again amongst the Druids. The Druids clearly were key figures in the building of all these ancient monuments in Britain, which we link with surveying, geophysics, astronomy. And Julius Caesar saying they have adopted the Greek alphabet and the belief in the indestructibility of the human soul. Yoga again, the extent and geographical distribution of the globe, natural philosophy, and on many problems connected with religion. So the Druids were a far higher culture than we have been led to believe, and the harder we look, the more we find supporting that. Another link's about Ogham, and now Ogham, a man well skilled in speech and poetry, invented the Ogham. The cause of its invention was that he wanted to prove his ingenuity. Well, that's rather fun. And he thought his language should belong to the learned ones, to the exclusion of the farmers and the herdsmen. In other words, there was an in-house alphabet text, the speedy writing of Enoch, which was used by the administrators in society, going way back thousands of years. Now we're back to what's going on. The book at the back there, called The Path of Light, is Christian O'Brien's translation of the Bruce and Askew codexes, where Jesus is teaching Surat Shabbat Yoga to his inner circle of disciples, which contain both men and women. In fact, Mary Magdalene is playing the major part. It's an incredibly important document because it's witnessed by Matthew, Philip and Thomas, 3 important scribes. And it tells us that Jesus was teaching what was being taught in the early schools, Druidic schools, Druidic academies, and the mystery schools. And here we have the seal from Mohenjo-daro, meditation. And here we've got a face going 3 ways. 1, 2, 3 ways. Mayan ball player also meditating. and Buddha, and Isis in the yoga position. The Egyptian, this is just a little clue as to what's going on, and this is about seeking the true personality, bringing out the best in every person, which is really what yoga is all about. We're all trying to reach higher levels of consciousness, physical fitness, mental ability, all the things that Peter was talking about in his presentation. And the clues are here. But we have here the concept of opposing elements, which by uniting together maintain harmony in life. This was expressed by in the Egyptian symbolism by the image of Akka. It's important to learn more about someone's natural tendencies so that one can show him how to be good, how to be creative, how to respect himself, and how to acquire self-realization. This was the essence of education in ancient Egypt. All children were tested at the age of 5 in the temples in order to direct their destiny according to their own natural inclinations. According to the car of each individual, mankind can be divided into 7 kinds. And this will interest you. I'm not sure that this is a later period, but it gives an interesting clue. Evil humans. These are the lowest kind of human, being on the ladder to heaven. These kind of humans live by the laws of force. These people are the mass murderers, rapists, and so on. Little humans. These humans live by social laws. They cheat, lie, gossip, and hurt others for no reason at all. Gentle humans. These humans live by the law of righteousness, since they're always striving to live the right way. This class of people is responsible for the advancement of any nation. Masters. These humans live by the law of love. Sages. These humans live by the law of virtue. They are teachers of the masters, and they refuse to be known publicly. Immortals. These humans are governed by God directly. They live eternally, and the law of death does not apply to them. There are 3 kinds of immortals: basic, terrestrial, and celestial. And the last of the 7 kinds of humans are the inhabitants of the kingdom of heaven, this is what it says in the text. These souls are governed by God directly, and they live in the Milky Way and sing a song daily to the Creator. There we are. Hope for all of us. Law is the precursor to freedom. Keep thou not silent when evil is spoken, for truth like the sunlight shines above all. He who oversteppeth the law shall be punished, for only through law comes the freedom of men. Cause thou not fear, for fear is bondage, a fetter that binds the darkness of men. And this is from the wisdom of Thoth, and the same links to our books of Enoch and the ancient laws. This is what was happening Bangor on Dee in the time of Pelagius, 390 AD. And Bangor on Dee was, I believe, it was the most important monastery, as it's called, but it would have been, I believe, the most senior of the Druid academies in Britain. And certainly St. Paul visited Bangor on Dee, the first place he came to when he came to Britain, which gives us a lot of clues. But this is the quote: "Without freedom of will, there is no humanity. Freedom of conscience was both the birth and breath of manhood. The essence of the soul was will." And this was the basic Druid doctrine promoted by the British Church under its intellectual leader, Pelagius, at Rome in AD 396 to 415, until he was unjustly declared a heretic by the followers of Augustine of Hippo. Augustine had insisted upon the Catholic dogma of original sin and divine grace, which we touched on earlier. And Augustine of Hippo was killed by the Vandal Aryan Christians in North Africa. We have a word here of Enil, that free will is absolutely crucial. Wisdom is the gift of Enil, the embodiment of the word. It has the attribute of freedom. He also says there is no duality. The description of the Shining Ones: great height, radiant countenances, shining eyes, bronze skins, and deep loud voices. And these are the texts from the Secrets of Enoch and from Daniel, where we have descriptions of them. I don't expect they were so much different from us, to be honest. Lawrence Gardner makes his points about the Anunnaki. And he says here, the Anunnaki presence may baffle historians, their language may confuse linguists, their advanced techniques may bewilder the scientists, but to dismiss them is foolish. The Sumerians have themselves told us precisely who the Anunnaki were, and neither history nor science can prove otherwise. And I'm going to leave the last word to Confucius, And this is what Confucius says about the Golden Age, or the Great Tao. When the Great Tao prevailed, the whole world was one community. Men of talent and virtue were chosen to lead the people. Their words were sincere, and they cultivated harmony. This was called the Age of Universality. Thank you very much.